I didn't want the usual. I thought it'd be kind
I know something about that.
right. I just wanted something a little bit different, and I was gonna try to find some kind of beautiful wedding picture thing, and then I thought, no, I want a fucking zombie wedding. So,
Yeah. Stick to the Sagittarius Mercury brand, Antoine.
right. So we may as well, because since that's kind of more, especially for me, I've never been married, so it may as well be a zombie wedding as far as I'm concerned. I didn't see the maid of honor in the background here. Okay, let's move in. All right, so we're starting with the seventh house. The seventh house is the Western angle, right? And so this we've seen this a few times because I tend to bring this up so that we get an idea of what the difference between the angles. And we went back to this last week when we were looking at Martial, and looking at what the angles were in his chart and how those kind of were, and who were in the angles of his chart. And if you remember, the Mars was in the fourth in Scorpio, the Venus was in the seventh, and the Jupiter was in the first in that chart. And they all were very specific to everything that was kind of going on with him and the religion aspect and everything else. And Louise is coming in now. Okay, so we can see that based on this older way of looking at things, angles and succeedance were considered the most powerful. And of course, we know the term that was used. It's either they are advancing, right? Either planets are in a state of advancement when they're in angles or succeedant houses, or they're in a state of retreat. And so, and angles are the strongest. Succeedant houses are next in strength, and then cadence houses were considered weak. And you can see here also so if you have a question about a lost object, if it's in an angle, it's where you are, it's in the house, it's in your abode. If it's a succeedant house, then it's not too far away, and then it's a long way off for cadence, et cetera, et cetera. But I just thought I would bring this out so we can be reminded of the importance that has been consistently given to angles. And remembering that angularity represents, when we think about advancement and angularity, that angularity really kind of represents visibility, that which is public. So think about your family. The family has kind of a public reputation, even though it tends to have a private life. There's a private element to the family, but then there's also a public aspect to the family, how you're seen in the community. Obviously, the first house is you showing up, right? The 10th house, we've just been talking about that and your public reputation, right? So your public self. And then the 7th house is when your relationship is made public. I remember when I was in high school and the first and only girlfriend that I ever had. And I remember we had this conversation about, you're not really dating somebody until everybody knows you're dating. In high school, that's kind of the case. It's like, you're not really a couple until you're publicly, until you announce yourself publicly as a couple. And so in all the cases of the angles, we're dealing with angularity equals publicity or a public situation, or a situation of visibility. Also, as you can see, infancy for the, notice how it goes, it's going clockwise here. It's going 1, 10, 7, 4. So infancy for 1, youth for the 10th, maturity for the 7th, and old age for the 4th house. So, and of course, remembering that the 4th house is the place of the grave, right? So that's the end of the line and the place of the grave. So starting with Manilius, and then going obviously into modern. This is something that this is from Deborah Holdings, Temples of the Sky. And so this is where we kind of start with, it's all pretty, for the most part, as we're going to see, I won't say there's very little kind of change or switch. There's not a whole lot of variation. It's all very, very consistent throughout almost the entire history. Consummation of affairs, the conclusion of toil. That's interesting, conclusion of toil. So 6th house would be the toil maybe, and so maybe the 7th house would be the end of that. The closing years and the end of life, that's interesting, because also death, I was going to say, so I was just going to mention that. So remember that in the Hellenistic period, the 7th house represented death, or what they called the beginning of death, because that's where the sun goes under the horizon. So that's when the light is extinguished, and we no longer have the light of the sun. So that, and of course, remember that the sun also is the significator for life and vitality. And so when the light is extinguished, that means that we're dead, or that means it's the death of light, and spirit equals light. Worship of the gods, marriage. I don't know where that comes from. Worship of the gods, marriages, leisure, social events, and banquets. That's interesting. Social events and banquets. Nowadays we'd be looking at which house for that? We'd be looking at the 5th house, more than likely, for things like leisure, social events, and banquets. Of course, if it's a social event or a banquet connected to marriage, then that makes sense that it'd be more of a 7th house oriented thing. But we can see that before they started, and I think Manilius' time, they only had 5 houses. But we can see that during, things kind of started getting separated from the 7th into the 5th because of Venus's joy in the 5th. Others, marriage, Firmicus Maternus, I think he's like 4th or 7th century or something like that. Nature, number of marriages, cardinal, but aspected detrimentally to the ascendant, of course, because of 180-degree aspect. Alberuni, women, concubines, marriage feasts. So there's feasts again, banquets. Contentions, partnerships, losses, lawsuits. Okay, so now we start coming into this issue of lawsuits, partnerships, and contention. Notice we don't really see that very much, although we do see that there are some negative aspects to the 7th because that's where the sun sets, right? So the closing years and the end of life, death, and then now that's been turned into, instead of death and the closing years, that's been turned into those who oppose you, right? Because the 7th house opposes the ascendant, so it becomes those who are in opposition to you. And so contentions, also those with whom you partner, like a wife or a husband, but also like a business partner. And then, and we even hear this term now, that's my work husband, or that's my work wife, or whatever, right? So it's a person that we work really closely with, we've started calling them work husbands and work wives. And of course, we spend so much fucking time at work that it makes sense. Marriage partners, so Lily, so we've skipped like, what, 800 years now to Lily, marriage partners, public known enemies. So once again, that concept of public, that which is public in the angles, and the angles rather, not the ankles. Thieves, and see, this is the first we see of thieves, but we do see losses here, right? So, and we'll see a little bit more of that with Bonatti. And then the modern, those with whom we must share our lives or actions, or those in a close relationship or of an emotional or business nature. Open enemies, the not self projection. So even though that's in the, the usual kind of psychobabble, it's not very different at all from Manilius, or from, especially maybe from Alberuni, right? So it looks like from Alberuni's time, he's what, 8th century. So from Alberuni's time to the modern time, things have been pretty consistent, or really, or these other classical things, but certainly marriage has always been connected to it. So for the entire history of astrology, 7th house has represented the spouse and marriage. The interesting thing is that also, Bonatti also considers the 7th house the house of women. The house of women. And so I thought that that was kind of interesting, that because once again, up until, I don't know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 120 years ago, maybe towards the end of the 19th century, primarily men were clients for astrology, right? And if we go back even further, most astrologers were kept on retainer by nobility or kings or royalty, right? So astrology didn't have really anything to do with women unless the woman was prominent enough that she could either afford an astrologer or use one. But that was a rarity. What you saw mostly, because women didn't really count, they didn't really matter, they didn't really count. What you saw instead was that it was a man's world, and so only men, astrology only really catered to the affairs of men, specifically men. So here we come into this idea of the 7th house as the descendant, and where the sun descends. So with the movement of the sun towards the ascendant, Egyptian philosophy recognized a weakening of vitality, a loss of power, death, or the necessity for retreat. Now, when we can even see this in the case of relationships. So we know, we've all known people who they were one person in a relationship. They were vivacious and fun and daring and whatever. And then they get into a relationship and they're meek and they're mild and they're subservient and they lose themselves and they lost that vitality and they're not the person we know anymore. And then you also see sometimes when the person themselves is in a relationship like that, then they're like, oh my God, you know, I totally lost myself. I gave them my power, right? It was a death of self as I went into that relationship. And so there's an aspect of that in the concept of intimate relationships that has been kind of moved over. So we're no longer looking at the seventh house as a place of death. But when we look at it from the idea of relationship, it can be a place of the death of the self. It can be a place of the death of the individuality. It can be a place where we let the other person lead and we take a back seat, right? So all of those things that we're looking at, weakening of vitality, a loss of power, death of the necessity for retreat, all of those things show up in relationship, right? Because there's this need to compromise, and in many aspects, it can become my way or the highway. One partner, it's my way or the highway, and the other one has to just acquiesce. So the lack of personal strength associated with the descendant gives it a reputation, or gave it a reputation as a hostile angle, where one is susceptible to the influence of malign events and enemies. Manilius linked it, or it's malign rather, sorry, malign events and enemies. Manilius linked it with the consummation of affairs and the closing years of life because the sun died here each night at sunset. It speeds the falling sky beneath the earth and buries the stars. Wonder not if it is called the portal of somber Pluto and keeps control over the end of life and death's firm bolted door. Here dies the very light of day, which the ground beneath steals away from the world and locks up captive in the dungeon of night. And once again, so this issue of opponents and opposition and opponent, all's fair in love and war. The signification of the seventh house for opponents and therefore the other, both in love and war, is partly explained by its diametrical aspect to the ascendant. However, the symbolic influence of the direction west is an integral element of this. The west is generally perceived as hostile or weakening through its association with darkness and has a very ancient signification related to those who confront us. Does anybody know, wait, Layla, is there a tradition in Pakistan that you should not, that when you sleep, your head should not face south, west rather, that your head should not be pointing west?
It's not about the head west. We are not allowed to put our feet in the direction of the Kaaba, of Makkah. That's one tradition that we follow.
Which would be east, right? Well, wait, no, that's west. That's west.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I see.
So,
it's
your sort of like that, west, the logic is that.
Your head can go, I see, so your head can go west, but your feet can't. Now, India is just the opposite. India has this thing where you don't want to turn your bed to the west. You don't want your head to be facing west because that's a place of death. And even to this day, I make a major thing out of not having my head face west when I'm sleeping.
Yeah, I think it would be the same thing because we're not, it's not like disallowed, but something that is not liked. Like your feet towards Mecca, but Mecca is east. So your head would be towards west, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's indirectly the same thing.
But Mecca is west of you, isn't it?
Wait, let me just check. Let me check.
Yes, Saudi Arabia is west of you. Right, you're east. You're further east than Saudi Arabia. Anyway, we'll check it out and I'll come back to it. Under Pythagorean philosophy, which takes its origin.
It's eastern from Pakistan. Mecca is east from Pakistan. Yeah.
Mecca is east of Pakistan?
Yeah.
Huh. That's fascinating. I'm going to want to look at that. All right, hold on. Okay, so let's come back to it now. So Pythagorean philosophy takes its origin from concepts employed by the ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians. The orientation right is linked to the east and left is linked to the west. And, you know, and so do you have that too? where oh well, sure you have it. Do you have it where you wipe your ass with the left hand?
Yep.
So does India. And there's the whole thing with what they call the dexter and the sinister. So left is sinister and dexter. So it's dextro y sinistro. So this idea of something that's sinister is left, and which is also west. So that connects to this as well. Throughout scripture and in all world philosophies, the symbolic use of the right or the east is taken to imply qualities that are beneficial, strong, righteous, direct, open, familiar, and fixed upon the self. Whereas the left and the west are symbolic of strength and energies given over to others, originating a sense of union, partnership, and committal, as seen in the house's association with marriage, but also implying a weakened sense of self, as we just talked about, and an indication of potentially harmful, indirect, obscure, sinister, there's the word, or unfamiliar energy. And of course, the other side of wiping your ass with your left is eating with your right. So so the food goes into your mouth with your right hand, and then you wipe the shit off your ass with your left. So here we start with Valens in the 2nd century. Benefics in this place and ruling the ascendant with a lot of fortune indicate good things for the native. Inheritances, interesting. Sudden acquisition of other property and benefits from a death. Now that all sounds like what house? What house does that sound like?
Sounds like the 8th house to me.
It sounds like the 8th house. Isn't that interesting? So we can see, so once again, we can see how aspects of the 7th house got put into the 8th, then aspect of the 7th house got put into the 5th. Because when we look at that is not about balance necessarily, but even when we look at Benatti about sex, sex isn't in the 5th house. Sex is in the 7th house. I mean, pleasure and enjoyment and amusement and sensual pleasure is in the 5th, but the actual, like your sexual behavior and how you act sexually, the sex that you have with others is actually in the 7th house. And even in the Benatti chapter on the 7th house, there is a full chapter in it on how the person has sex. What the person's sexual behavior is. It's not in the 5th house, it's in the 7th. Because the 7th house is the house of joining, right? And so we have to join in order to have sex, right? Or to especially join to have children in order to have sex. And knowing that the 11th house represents gain, right? That's one of the main terms that the 11th used to be considered. The 5th house is the 11th from the 7th, which means children are what you gain from matrimony. So think of it that way too. If the benefics are not in their own places, men are less prosperous, but not poverty-stricken. Now, this sounds a lot, some of this sounds a lot also like another concept in Jyotish, which is called Bhavat Bhavam. And Bhavat Bhavam means that a house, not only will a house like the 10th house have a signification, but so also will the 10th from the 10th, which is the 7th. So this acquisition of property and benefits, being prosperous and not poverty-stricken, feels also a little bit like this concept of Bhavat Bhavam, where the 7th house is the 10th from the 10th. And notice how it says here, if Mercury alone is in conjunction and in its proper face, the native will make gains in his old age and will be entrusted with cities and the affairs of kings. I wonder why that's the case, but I thought I would add that. Okay, here's Abu Mashar and Al-Kabizi, 7th out of wives and nuptials. Oh, but then also controversies and oppositions. The 7th house, now here we come to Al-Kabizi, of women and nuptials, contentions. Notice this is the first time we see women, contentions too, and partnerships and opponents. So we're going to keep with this. This is 9th century now. We're going to stay with this until until the 17th century, rather really until now. Because we still consider the 7th the house of open enemies, right? The hidden enemy is the 12th house, the open enemy is the 7th. And it signifies the middle of the end of life towards old age, which we just saw. And here we go with the triplicity rulers. So the first triplicity of rulers of the house of women signifies women. The second, contentions, and the third, uniting. Now, what I think is interesting, uniting with others, that's interesting. So maybe for a woman, the first triplicity ruler would represent men, right? Because a woman's going to marry a man, etc. So it might be an interesting thing to look at. And this also could, I mean, it'd be interesting to see if this represents just women generally for people, for a man. You know, so how women, not just the woman they marry, but how they deal with women generally. It'd be interesting to see if that's the case. But definitely look how the second is contentions, and then the third is uniting. So this sounds like the third triplicity ruler is the marriage indicator, as opposed to, it looks like maybe the first triplicity ruler might be talking about the woman who becomes your wife. And then the third triplicity ruler talks about the nature of how we unite. We'll maybe look at that. I don't have a gigantic amount of charts today, but I have some really cool ones, and we'll look at that for that. Also, I know what I was going to say, Layla, or even Olivia, if you can think of anybody who experienced a life full of enemies, with lots of enemies, because I have two charts that I think will work, but if you know of anybody else, I wasn't really able to kind of rack my brain and think of anybody whose life was, like the characteristic of their life was that they were constantly met with enmity, there was a constant source of enemies and enmity in their life. And the two charts that I have do show it. Same thing, Maria, if you know of anybody. Oh, Britney Spears, did she have a lot of enemies, Maria? That's interesting. I know that
like Justin Timberlake outed her, and her father was like controlling of her and like wouldn't let her manage her own estate. And then
I remember that part.
Her next husband wouldn't let her see her kids. Like, I feel like, I don't know if that's enemies or not, but it just seems like a lot of, she had like a lot of people against her until very recently. And then everything kind of turned around and people were like, free Britney or whatever,
I remember but that sounds more like control and enslavement than enemies.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I wasn't sure, but I do remember she has like a super contentious life. I don't know if that would count.
Contentious, yes, that's true. Well, and we'll see. Maybe I'll pause it later when we get to the charts, and we'll look.
What about a whistleblower like Snowden or Assange or something?
Oh yeah, Assange.
Assange.
Yeah, that would have been a good one.
Yeah, Snowden.
Or Snowden, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll like I said, we'll pause it when we get to the chart part, and then we'll look for those charts. Those are good suggestions. Okay. So, well, the thing I forgot to do was I didn't put what Bonatti says in his general astrology book. I went immediately to the nativities book. And the very first thing you see here is how to figure out what the marriage is going to be like, or how to figure out what marriage is going to be, right? And so this is what we're looking at: the seventh and its lord, and which of the planets is found in it. Also the moon and Venus. Why would it be the moon and Venus? Venus is the lady of marriage. The moon is women. Boris Johnson, he's a fucker. He deserves it. Likewise, the part of marriage. And the planet in whose domicile you are. Maybe, Jeremy Corbyn makes more sense in my case, because, see, what I'm looking for is people who didn't necessarily bring on their own enmity, right? So like Boris Johnson has brought it on. See, Chelsea Manning, good idea. That's excellent. Yes, excellent. Okay, great. Keep them coming. Good. Yeah, so because otherwise I would have put Kathleen Battle in, right? Remember we talked about her, the most hated woman in classical music, but it's because she was such a bitch that she had so many enemies. It wasn't, she wasn't just kind of Jeremy Corbyn and brother. Or was there an issue between Jeremy Corbyn and his brother? Interesting, I don't know. Okay, you will look at the planet, which is the Al-Muqtaz, over these places. And so actually Ben Dyke says he thinks that we should be looking at the planet that's the almutin of each place, as opposed to the compound almutin. But I think we could do both. I think we can do both. And usually that's what would be happening with Bonatti anyway. We would be doing both. We'd be looking at the almutin of each spot, or the ruler of each spot, or we would also be looking at the almutin or the almuqtaz of all of these parts together. And I did it for two of the people that we're going to look at. I did compound almutins excuse me, for 2 of them. And you will see if they are free from the impediments which have been frequently stated and are made fortunate and strong. So, and look at how he also mentions this. You will look at the planet, which is the Amuktas, over these places, or over the angles of the figure of the nativity which you see, which is, and their succeedance, which is interesting. And so Ben Dykes was saying that he thought because generally the angles have to do with public, with that which is public, and also that which advances. He thought any planets that rule the angles are going to kind of have some kind of, what did he say? They're going to have some kind of testimony in how the marriage will go, especially because marriage is a publicly recognized institution. And here we see, if indeed the 7th sign were Cancer or Scorpio or Pisces, which are the fertile signs, or the conjunction of the Lord of the 7th, or its Almuktas with the Lord of the 1st, or its Almuktas were in them or out of them, or one of them, it signifies the native is going to have many wives or a great abundance of other women. Indeed, if you were to find the contrary of that which was said, you could judge the contrary. So if the cusp of the 7th is one of the fertile signs, or the conjunction of the Lord of the 7th, or its Almuktas with the Lord of the 1st, or its Almuktas were in them or out of them. So, so in other words, if the 7th house has those on the sign, or there's a conjunction between the 1st and the 7th, is how I'm reading this. If anybody thinks that I'm wrong about that, let me know. Or the Almuktas of the 7th were in them or out of them, or one of them. That's kind of weird. That last one, or one of them. Oh wait, oh, we're in them or out of them, or in one of them. I see, we're in them or out of them, or one of them. Or I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what that or one of them part means. That's weird. It signifies the native is going to have many wives or a great abundance of other women. Bam. Okay, so that's something to look at, and we will be looking at that. More Benatti on marriage. Now this is more kind of going in to what to look, to what to look for and how marriages will be. And this is a continuation of what we just read. So if they, especially the Lord of the 7th or the Almuktas over it, were joined to the Lord of the Ascendant or the nativity or its Almuktas, all or some of them, by a trine or sextile aspect, and more so if reception intervenes, and the Lord of the 7th is lighter than the Lord of the Ascendant, which means what? The Lord of the 7th is applying to the Lord of the 1st. It signifies that the native will be married to a good and fitting woman, and with whom he will rejoice to his wishes. However, the aforesaid aspect were without reception, or the aspect were a square with reception, it signifies that the native will marry, but his marriage will be much below the aforesaid. If, however, it were a square without reception, it will be much less even though, and if the Lord of the Ascendant were joined to the Lord of the 7th, so that the Lord of the Ascendant is applying to the Lord of the 7th, it signifies the native is going to be desirous of copulating with women. Isn't that interesting? So if the Lord of the 7th is applying to the Lord of the 1st, that means that there will be a good marriage, like a good lawful marriage. If the Lord of the 1st is going to the Lord of the 7th, is applying to the Lord of the 7th, then that means that the man is trying to, get with as many women as he can. Very interesting. Lighter means, remember, lighter means the same thing as slow, as faster. Right, so the heavier planets are, Saturn and Jupiter, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, those would be considered heavy and also slow. And so Moon and Mercury and Venus would be considered light and also fast. So when they say lighter, that's what they mean, it's faster. In other words, it's the differences between when the 7th is applying to the 1st and the Lord of the 1st is applying to the 7th. Okay, so we now come forward about 300 years to Scherner. And he says about the 7th house of the West, it shows the dowry, which of course that doesn't make sense on some level, right? Because the dowry is what? It's the substance of the wife to be, which sounds like it should really actually be the 8th. But look at what he's got in the 8th. Death, inheritances, occult faculties, great fears, sadness, lethal poisons, right? So nothing to do with marriage at all. State of the marriage, contentions and dissensions and damages that come from the foregoing. It rules from then the part of the body, rules the umbilicus to the buttocks with the groin, kidneys, the loins, and co-significator the moon, because the moon is what? the significator for women. And then we come to Lily. So this part's it goes kind of fast. It gives judgment of marriage and describes the person inquired after, whether it be man or woman, and all manner of love questions. Okay, so that's the first time that we see this. And I think that it's important to understand that, and it's still something that we see in the Eastern world, and especially in India and Pakistan and other places like that are highly patriarchal. We see arranged marriages where whether you or not you love the motherfucker doesn't matter, right? What matters is, especially in India, what matters is he the same caste? Does he come from a different gotra? Does he make decent money? Is the family compatible? Does he come from a decent family? Will he make good money? All of these different things. And then nowadays, even arranged marriage is kind of changing in India, where now like they want people to kind of meet each other and get to know each other and make the decision on their own, even if there's no love there, right? Even if they're not in a relationship already. Even though the marriage is arranged, they want you to get to know each other. They want your consent in the arrangement. But before, you had 7-year-olds getting married to 40-year-olds, right? There was no such thing. Or they ask you to fall in love, right? They want you to, right? They're kind of coercing you into it, right? So they're trying to coerce you into falling in love. But they ultimately, and it's interesting because I've having lots of Indian friends. I have many friends who are in arranged marriages, and almost all of them have told me that, especially if they're under 45, have told me, oh, well, you know what? Well, it wasn't so bad. We met and we got to know each other, and it wasn't just the kind of thing where my parents said you're marrying this guy. Whereas 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that was how it was. You were just going to marry who your parents said you were going to marry, and you could be 12 and he could be 80, and that was just going to be how it was going to be. Let's see. So our public enemies: the defendant in a lawsuit; in war, the opposing party; all quarrels, duels, lawsuits; in astrology, the artist himself. Isn't that interesting? And that's one of the reasons that there was one of the restrictions for reading a horary chart is if you see Saturn in the 7th, right? So if you see Saturn in the 7th, you shouldn't read it, because that means that either they're playing a trick on you or you're going to disgrace yourself somehow because you, the astrologer, are the 7th, right? Because why? Because the querent, the person asking the question, is the 1st house. In physics, the physician, right? So this is the whole medical astrology difference. Thieves and thefts, right? This is that. Now, this is probably something that came up. When did we see? We saw losses. Remember, we saw losses when we were in Al-Biruni, right? And it was only as we kind of come into the 14th, 15th century that we really start seeing this idea of the 7th house and theft. And the 7th house being the person who is stealing, which is interesting because on some level you'd think it would more have to do with the 12th house, right? It would be somebody that you don't know, that's somebody you don't know who's stealing your goods, but maybe because it has to do with also with having your property stolen. There seems to be something connected to the 7th house and property and prosperity. And so since someone is kind of encroaching on your prosperity and stealing your property, maybe that's where the 7th house connection with thieves is, whether man or woman. Wives, sweethearts, their shape, description, condition, nobly or ignobly born. In an annual ingress, whether war or peace may be expected. Of victory, who overcomes and who is worsted. Fugitives or runaways, banished and outlawed men. It has co-significators Libra and the moon. See, now we come into this zodiac alphabet bullshit. Saturn or Mars, unfortunate herein, will show ill fortune in marriage, right? And we've already seen that with some charts. Of color or dark black color. Isn't that interesting? It rules the haunches, so that's your ass. The navel to the buttocks, and it's called the angle of the West and is masculine. Isn't that funny? They were just saying that it was feminine, and now he's saying it's masculine. Okay, so what we just did, I'm gonna change the share for a second. What I did was I basically used Lily to look at two different people. This is Ernest Hemingway, and this is Zsa Zsa Gabor. I didn't put her name there, but and Zsa Zsa Gabor was married 9 times. Oops. 9 times, mind you. So definitely she's someone we want to look at. Hemingway was married 4 times. So let's go and look at Ernest Hemingway's chart. So for those of you who are not aware of who Ernest Hemingway is, Ernest Hemingway was one of the most celebrated authors of the 20th century, of American authors of the 20th century. He was hypermasculine. He was highly chauvinistic and hypermasculine. He lived a very kind of adventurous life, and was known for, oh, thank you. Was known for hunting and boxing. He was very much a very macho, for machismo, very macho, and look at how the Mars is there in the first house. And look at how the Mercury, the ruler of the ascendant, is in a masculine sign of Leo. But what we're really looking for is the marriage. Ernest Hemingway was married 4 times. So, I mean, my own birth mother was married 3 times, right? And I thought that was a lot. But then you meet people who've been married 4 or 5 times. On to Zsa Zsa Gabor, who was married 9. Elizabeth Taylor was married 6 times. Oh, we could put Elizabeth Taylor in here. But what we do see here is what? What did he say? If Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces is on the cusp of the 7th, there's a possibility of multiple marriages, right? And also, if the ruler of that is also in one of those signs, we've got the possibility of multiple marriages. Now, so the places that we wanted to look at were the 7th house, its ruler, any planets in the 7th, the moon and Venus, the part of marriage, and the part of marriage and the part of, the part of marriage and its ruler. So I'm going to come here for a second. So what we see here is that the lot of men's marriages, and of course, like I said, this is from the introduction to astrology that includes Abu Mashar and Al-Kabizi. And so no later than the 9th century, all of this stuff is in Bonatti. And I thought Bonatti was like the main person, but when we get to it, almost to the word, much of this stuff is in Bonatti's book. So what we see here is that there are 2. The first one is the lot of Hermes Trismegistus, and it's day or night, Saturn to Venus. Now notice it's men's marriages. So Saturn to Venus, and then there's a second one, which is the Valens version, which is Sun to Venus. So let's look for it. Now, in the mutant section, or in the compound on mutant section, what I did was I used the first one. But we didn't necessarily have to, but we'll look at both of them, and then but I used the first one, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so men's marriages, it's Saturn to Venus. So Saturn to Venus is 210 degrees -4, 210 degrees, that's Aries, 8 degrees of Aries, -4 is 4 degrees of Aries. There the Mars is in the first house. And look at how it's in Virgo, right? So that shows, so, this is a person that was married 4 times and couldn't, and was very overbearing to his wives, to the women in his life. Very much the man, my way or the highway, as we say. Moved women around, because he was moving around to different places. So he lived in Cuba, he lived in, Key Largo. He lived, he was a journalist, he was a war correspondent during the Spanish Civil War, which is where he met his second wife. And look, look at that. Mars is the ruler of the part of marriage. He met one of his wives during the Spanish Civil War. Now, let's look at the second one. The second one is Sun to Venus, and that's back 15 degrees. So from the ascendant, back 10 is 28, and back another 5 is 23. So now we've got the Mercury on the conjungi, but it's ruled by the Sun. The Sun's overbearing, and look at how the Sun is in a fertile sign. Now, then why did I use this one? I just used it because I was reading a really interesting, Deborah Holding has, her own site called skyscript.co.uk. I'll write it in the chat. Some fantastic, it's really, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best astrology site, besides my own, of course, but no, much better than mine. And she had a forum. She had a forum for a long time where people would write in, and lots of experts on classical astrology would write in, around questions and stuff. And I remember reading a discussion about these parts, and people writing that what they had seen in their own exploration or in their own research was that the first part, which was the one that was in 4 Aries, tended to represent marriages. And the second part, which was the one that was at 23 Leo, tended to represent the sexual nature of the person, or tended to represent kind of how they kind of expressed themselves sexually. And so they were finding that tended to be the case. And I thought that was actually quite interesting. One of the things that I think is also interesting, though, too, is, and maybe I should have actually used the second one, because on some level it makes more sense, but I just wanted to use the first one because I had remembered that discussion. But look at how the part of fortune, the 7th from the part of fortune, is the sun. And the part of conjungi, the second part of conjungi, is in the 7th from the part of fortune. So I think that's kind of interesting. And like I said, even though I used the first one, we're going to see that it still ended up being rather useful. So what I did was I looked at the 7th house, which was 8 Pisces, and here's all the essential dignities of each spot. 8 Pisces and 2 Scorpio, Lord of the 7th is Jupiter. Nothing in the 7th. Here's the moon. Here's Venus. Here's the part of marriage, the first one, and here's the ruler of the part of marriage. Oh, that's wrong. I did that wrong. Oh, no wonder. Oh, so that this part is wrong. My bad. Hold on one second. Okay. So actually, where is that Mars again? I'm going to actually put us on pause for a second while I fix this. Okay, so I've just fixed my difficulty, or the thing that I screwed up. I fixed my mistake, where instead of using the position of Mars, I used the position of the sun. And so now I've switched it to the position of Mars, who's at 21 Virgo, and we've got Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, Jupiter, Mercury. And that gave Mercury 10 more points, and it took 4 points away from Jupiter, who was very much in the lead. Which means that as a result, Jupiter, Venus, and Mars, and the moon, all have the same amount. They all have the same amount of things. So they're all kind of, so what I think I might need to do then is change it again. What I might have needed to do was change it to the actual second one, which made more sense. But I'm not going to do that now. But when I did it incorrectly, then Jupiter made the most sense. And of course, when we look at his chart, we see that the Jupiter is in a fertile sign, which would represent many children. So what was it? It was Jupiter, it was Venus, it was the moon, it was Mars. All 4 of those were tied for first place. Look though, even though the Mars is in the first house, Mars is in what kind of sign? He's in a sterile sign. So I wouldn't really expect for that to kind of represent, or for that to show us how many marriages. It might show us that there were problems in marriage, contentions in marriage, right? But look at how the moon's next application is to Venus. And Venus is in her own triplicity. She's the strongest of all these planets. She's in her own triplicity, right? The moon's in detriment. So I would, if of all those 4, I would probably use this Venus. And Venus is also in a fertile sign, right? So even if we're just using it that way, Venus is in a fertile sign, Jupiter's in a fertile sign. And also remember that Venus and Jupiter are the domicile ruler and the exaltation ruler of Pisces. Venus is going to the sextile of Mars, who's the ruler of the first part of marriage, and who's the ruler of the, oh, and the ruler of the seventh is that. So there's not really much going on with the rule. Everybody's kind of already left the ruler of the actual ruler of the seventh. But if we used Venus as that instead, if we used Venus as that, you know, in addition or whatever, then we would see that there's this connection with the first triplicity ruler. I'm not the first triplicity ruler, the first ruler of the part of marriage. And then also she is cohabitating with the second ruler of the part of marriage, right? So there are two parts of marriage. One of them was in Aries, the other one was in Leo, and she is with the ruler, the ruler of the second part of marriage, and she's in sextile to the first part of marriage. So I would make her, based on what we just looked at, I think I would choose her. And look, it just turned into our Venus. So maybe that's my confirmation. So I would use her instead then in this particular case. But we do have a situation where a person had more than one marriage or many marriages, and more than two, right? I mean, these days it's not really it's not uncommon at all to see a person with two marriages, right? It is much less common to see a person who's had four marriages, even now, right? And Hemingway died in 1962, right? So by the fourth, he was married to his fourth wife by 1958 or something like that, or 1948 or 49, right? So that wasn't so common at the time. It was more common with this kind of with the set of people who were like movie stars and celebrities and famous writers. It was more that way with the famous and the wealthy, but much less generally kind of accepted. So here's Ernest Hemingway, and who's had four wives, and we can see it in the chart. Now let's look at the triplicity rulers, remembering that the first triplicity ruler is women, and that's the Venus. And notice that this Moon-Venus opposition. So one of the things that I tend to see with Moon-Venus opposition is issues with women. Just like when I often see Sun-Saturn oppositions, it's often issues with the father, right? And so often there are mommy issues in this. I remember there was this, I used to work at this gym, and there was this absolutely gorgeous, oh my God, he was such a fucking stud. He was so beautiful, total Adonis. And he was the #1 trainer. This was a really, really wealthy gym. It was really, really high end. And he was the #1 trainer at this high end gym. His name was Jordan, and he was so gorgeous. Beautiful body, gorgeous man, super personable and nice and funny. Jordan, we all had a dance. We had like a big Christmas party dance, like a big disco dance Christmas party at some spot, and Jordan brought his girlfriend. The woman was at least 20 years older than he was, and Jordan had Moon-Venus opposition. Because I remember that's when I started getting into astrology and started doing other people's charts using classical techniques, and I started collecting people's charts from the gym. And that's the first time that I had one of my astrological wins. I remember one of the other trainers, I had asked him for his, and he said, and so he goes, oh, blah, 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 blah. He goes, but I was handicapped. I was raised handicapped, or I was born handicapped. And I said, well, don't tell me what part of the body. Let me see if I can guess it. And so after I did his chart, I came back into work, and I told everybody behind the desk, I said, I think I know what part of his body was incapacitated. And they said, which one? And I said, it was the hip. And so he came over, and I said, was it the hip? And he goes, I said, which one was it? He goes, it was hip. And we all were like, oh my God. And so that was like one of my before I started reading for people publicly, or professionally, that was one of my very first astrological wins. But Jordan, who brought the woman who was, she was old enough to be his mother, and he was doting on her, and I mean, I just couldn't believe it. And you could tell she was still disoriented. She felt so damn lucky. You could tell she couldn't really fully process, because she had this fucking gorgeous young stud who was just treating her like gold. And she wasn't even like a super beautiful older woman, but I don't know, Jordan loved her, and Jordan had mommy issues. So Ernest Hemingway has female issues / female trouble. And so we see that Venus-Moon opposition in connection with that. Also the sextile to the Mars, right? And then, so the second triplicity ruler is contentions. And that would be Mars, who's here in the first house. So that gives us a clue that the marriages that there might be seventh house problems involving contentions, right? And then the third triplicity ruler is the moon herself, who's in detriment. So, and that's the joining or unions, if you remember. So we can see from this that maybe there is a weak ability to join in this chart. That contention is very, very prominent, is advancing. Contention is what advances in this chart. And then maybe there is an idealization of women, right? Because Venus is in the 11th. So maybe there's this fantasy about women. Maybe there's this kind of fantastic ideal about women that the reality, like maybe this man could never fully, like I haven't fully read a lot about Ernest Hemingway because he's not my favorite, but more than likely, when you have men that are super macho, they usually don't have very realistic ideas about women, and usually don't know anything about women, have any real inkling about them, but are, you know, they want a Barbie doll or something like that. And I could certainly see that being the case with Hemingway. Matter of fact, they talked about how his third wife was the first woman to not cater to him. So thus, there we have that. Going back, and I'll come back to the slide. Okay, so now we come to marriage of women. So when we talk about, so now we're going to talk about Zsa Zsa. I don't know if either of you know about the Gabor sisters, and I didn't really know that. I mean, I grew up with them as television personalities as a kid, but I didn't really understand kind of what a kind of interesting life these women had, and especially Zsa Zsa, who was married 9 times. But Zsa Zsa was also Miss Hungary in 1936, and just fascinating. So it's interesting, when we get to a certain point, what I'm going to have us do is start looking at charts that we, you know, right now I kind of pretty much tailor make charts for the subject. But while I'm kind of doing my research about the person, often I see that, oh shit, this person, like, oh, for instance, Ernest Hemingway had a life full of accidents, physical accidents, full of physical injury. He was once in a bathroom and he thought that he was pulling in the old water closets, there would be like a chain that you would pull, and that's how you flush the toilet. Oh, in India, you still see those, and probably in Pakistan too. So he thought he was doing that, and he ended up, I think, what was it? A ceiling fan fell on his head or something. Mars in the first, possibly. I mean, we can come back to it, but that'd be something we'd want to look at for, you know, people who are accident prone. Mars is also the ruler of the 8th in the chart, right? So that's an interesting thing. So you got the ruler of the 8th and the first. And, you know, when we looked at Maciel has ruler of the 8th and the first as well. So maybe we can see that with the 8th and the first, there is a danger to self, and there's a possible danger to others. There could be possible danger, the possibility of danger to self or danger to others. Obviously, danger to the physical body because ruler of the 8th is in the first. But we also, there was something, another thing where I saw where, oh, I know what it was. The ruler of the 7th and the ruler of the 8th were in the first, and this woman, every man that she had dated had died in some kind of tragic way. Fascinating. Anyway, so interesting that he doesn't go into the same amount of, or rather, he probably feels like he doesn't have to, because we'd be looking at the same significators, but just looking at a few things that are different. So Ptolemy said the marriages of women, we should consider the solar qualities in their nativities, right? The sun is men. Because what were we looking at? We were looking at Venus and the moon for men's nativities. So in the solar, for women, we would be looking at the sun and Saturn. And so whether the sun is found in one of the 2 eastern quarters, he even says, so basically from the 10th to the 4th. So between the 10th and the 7th, and the ascendant to the 4th. Which is said to from the 10th up to the ascendant, and from the 4th up to the 7th. That doesn't make sense because that's the northwest quarter. That's interesting. I don't know where that comes from. But those are also the 2 masculine quarters. Oh, that's why he's saying that. Okay, those are the 2 masculine quarters, so he's calling those Eastern. And then the two western quarters are the from ascendant to 4 and from 7 to 10. I see why. So if they're in the masculine quarters, this will signify a female native is going to be betrothed by marriage to an adult man in her youth or to a young man in her old age. Where's your son, Layla Akbar?
I was just reading the last paragraph, and my son is in the second house in whole sign and first house in the Alcabaeus.
And okay, so first in Alcabaeus, second in, okay, which means it's in one of the western angles or western quarters, but if the sun were between the ascendant and the 4th or between the 7th and the 10th, her marriage will be delayed. And certainly, even though you have been married young, it's being delayed, isn't it?
Yep.
Or she will marry an old man while she is a young girl. Is your husband much older than you?
No, he's the same age as I am.
I thought so, yeah, but the delay part, that's interesting. And Ali said that if the significator were under the rays, I think he's talking about the significator of the 7th house, it is signified that she will have none. But if the sun were in a fixed sign, it will signify she is going to copulate with only one man. Where's your son? Are you Capricorn like me?
Yep.
Okay, so not that. Which if some Oriental planet were in that sign, you will announce he is going to be a young man, and it could be that she will acquire another after him. So what is it? She'll be with only one man if it's a fixed sign, which makes sense. If, however, it were occidental, he will already have left his youth behind. If the sun were in a common sign, so that's mutable, you will pronounce that she is going to have two husbands, right? The double-bodied signs, which if some Oriental planet are found in that sign, or for each one of them, you will join another husband to them. But if they are not of good condition, they will signify fewer husbands. Look at this thing in parentheses, which if some Oriental planets are found in that sign, for each one of them, you will join another husband to them. So basically he's saying that if you see the sun in a common sign, and there's another planet Oriental of the sun in that same sign, so in other words, an earlier degree of that same sign, then add for however many planets, add another husband. So, you know, if we were looking at Zsa Zsa Gabor, she should have the whole kit and caboodle in there, right? But if they are not of good condition, they will signify fewer husbands. Indeed, if the sun were in a movable sign, you will judge the female native is going to have many husbands. So we're going to look at that when we get to Zsa Zsa. Okay, where's the sun? It's not, it's in Aquarius. So that should say one husband, shouldn't it? Right, if we're talking about it that way. But what we did instead this time was we looked at the compound on mutant for her. Did I do it right this time? Yes, I did. Let's go look at her chart. Jojo. Oh, you know, I had a friend over last night, and he's the one that told me, because I was like, oh, because it turns out his father's been married 4 times. And so I was trying to get a chart for him. His father's 90 and they don't have the information. And he goes, oh God, you should think about somebody like Zsa Zsa Gabor. She was married, I think, 10 times. I'm like, really? I had no idea. I mean, I vaguely remembered, he kind of stirred my memory back about Zsa Zsa. Anyway, so notice once again, we've got the fertile signs on the 7th cusp. Right? So already that shows that there's a possibility for more than one. In this particular case, the ruler of the 7th is in Aries. Notice how it's in the 30th degree. And so that's not a good position for any planet. And so one of the things that we want when we want marriage is we want durability, right? We want a marriage to be durable. And so in order for a marriage to be durable, as far astrologically speaking, then the planet that rules it needs to be in pretty good shape, right? This Jupiter is not. He's in the 30th degree, which is, like basically Benatti himself says, a planet in the 30th degree has no more power in that sign. They're preparing for the power that they're going to have in the next. So I mean, even though this can bring, even though we've got the part of fortune here too, right? So it can bring the marriage, it can certainly bring it, but can it sustain it? Can it make it a durable marriage? Not necessarily. And look at how, So sorry. And look at how the Venus, who's, remember, the exaltation ruler of Pisces, isn't this funny how both of the charts I chose were Virgo rising charts? You know, I mean, I wasn't even really trying to do that, you know, but like, as we see, I always naturally kind of intuitively gravitate to charts that are similar or that have similar significations. And we see that the Venus is applying to the square of the Jupiter, right? Remembering two things. One, Venus is the natural significator for marriage. She is the lady of marriage. And then two, she is the exaltation ruler of Pisces. So we've got the domicile ruler and the exaltation ruler in square. And not only are they in square, Jupiter is in her detriment and she is in his fall. So that doesn't bode so well for marriage, does it? Even if there's going to be a marriage, I mean, with the fertile signs on the set, or the fertile sign on the seventh cusp, it says, okay, there probably will be more than one marriage. But when we look at how the marriage is going to show up, and note also how the Mercury is with the Venus. Mercury is applying to the Venus, and will then translate the Venus to the Jupiter. But once again, Jupiter doesn't like any of that, right? Jupiter doesn't like any of that. He didn't like any of it because it's all coming from his fall. Actually, one of the things that she said was, she said, I'm a very good housekeeper. The moment I get divorced, I always keep the house. So she was funny, but you know, we can see that if there's going to be marriage in the chart, and you know, it's the two benefics, even though they're both. I mean, Venus isn't weak, the Jupiter is. I mean, Venus isn't. I mean, she's in the sign of triplicity, even though she's not ruling the triplicity because it's nighttime. But she's in the sign of her triplicity, so she's not fully weak. And Jupiter is Peregrine, you know, and he's the triplicity ruler, and he's the triplicity ruler of fire, and it's nighttime. So he's in his own triplicity. He's ruling that triplicity by night. So he's actually, they're kind of similarly strong, but when they come together, they're coming together in a way that helps neither of them. And it's by square. So not only does it help neither of them, but it's a negative reception. It's what we call negative reception, right? So positive reception would be just the opposite. Jupiter would be in Libra, she'd be in Cancer. There'd be the square with reception that Bernardi talked about earlier in this session. But with this one, we've got Jupiter and Venus in the negative reception. So we might not really experience good things in marriage, or marriage might marriage might bring also, what did we talk about with Jupiter Venus? Too much of a good thing. Too much of a good thing for Jupiter Venus, remember? And in this case, it's too much of a good thing that's actually not really all that good, right? Too much of a good thing that turns out to not be so good. Now, this is an amazing chart too. This is an amazing chart for loss of money, loss of gigantic amounts of money, and extreme long life. She died a few months short of her 100th birthday. And loss of a limb. She had to have a limb, she had to have a leg amputated. She was in a bad car accident. She also, a lot of accidents, and especially in the latter part of her life, accidents and strokes, etc., amputation. Remember how Ella Fitzgerald had her legs amputated as well? And so, interesting. When we talked about Hemingway committed suicide. He shot himself. There's the Mars on the Ascendant. Anyway, so let's now look to see who the part of marriage is. So, and for women, it's different. Now, because so many women get their charts read, I used these a lot. And I found that, personally, the lot of women's marriages, the Valens lot, tended to be more descriptive of what I was seeing with my clients. So I use that in the compound on mutant, but we're going to look for both. So the first one is Venus to Saturn by day or night, and the second one is Moon to Mars by day or night. Okay, what is it? Venus to Saturn? And so what Venus to Saturn is 180 minus 2. So 180 minus 2 is 25, 23 degrees of Pisces. So that makes sense, you know, with having a lot of marriages, it would make sense, even though we know that the Jupiter is not really in the best of shape because of being in the 30th degree. But the other thing is it brings us back to this Jupiter, Venus, too much of a good thing that may not really be all that good, right? It brings us back to that. The next thing that we see that we're looking for is Moon to Mars. So Moon to Mars is 180 plus 9. And so that, if we go 25 plus 9 is 4 degrees of Aries. So isn't that almost the exact same as Ernest Hemingway? That's fucking weird. Okay, so 4 degrees of Aries with the Jupiter there. So the ruler of the 7th is on the part of marriage. See, this is why I think that the Vettius Valens one is better. And then the other thing that I think on some level shows this better too is if you're going to get married 9 times, you're restless. There's something restless about you, right? There's something that's not quite settled. There's something not quite settled about you if you're getting married 9 times. Yes, the calculations for the lot of marriage by day. So for the first one for women, the Hermes lot is Venus to Saturn. The second one, which is the Valens lot, this is for women, is Moon to Mars. Okay, so when we did Venus to Saturn, it was 180 degrees minus 2, which brought us to 23 degrees of Pisces. When we did the Moon to Mars, it was 180 degrees plus 9, which brought us to 4 degrees of Aries. So both Hemingway and Zsa Zsa Gabor have one of their parts of marriage at 4 degrees of Aries. No reverse, day or night. Yeah, day or night, it's the same. So notice also that not only is the Venus's next application to the Jupiter, but so is Mars's. So here's one of the rulers. Matter of fact, that means that one of the rulers of the part, so the ruler of the part of marriage number 2 is applying to the ruler of the part of marriage number 1 and to the ruler of the 7th. Then also note that the ruler of the 7th is also the ruler of the part of fortune, who's also on the part of marriage. So we're talking about, this chart is about marriage, about relationships and marriage. What I was looking at was this Sun, Uranus, Mars thing, right? Wasn't he just saying something about if there's a planet that's east of the sun, but in the same, but it was only if it was in mutable signs. But I think one of the words that we use for Uranus is erratic, right? But another word that I tend to use for Uranus is restless. You know, you can't relax. It's like you've been plugged into a socket with Uranus, right? And so this person would never be satisfied. They'd get into the marriage and then they wouldn't be able to settle down. More than likely, all they want would be to settle down. But then once they settle down, they would probably find themselves so restless that they couldn't really fully commit or fully be, here's another thing, possibly fully be vulnerable, right? With the Venus-Saturn opposition, even though it's separating, the vulnerability would be a problem. And excess, some part of the life is out of control, right? What do I always say? I always look to see if what part of the life is out of control, and I usually look to see where Pisces is, right? Because when I see Venus and Jupiter together in any kind of aspect, I say, oh, what part of their life is out of control? And then I look immediately to see where Pisces is. And sure enough, there Pisces is. That's the part of the life out of control. So we've already seen now, then it doesn't show that there would be 10 marriages. I mean, I don't know if there's anything that can show that there would be, more than, like, exceedingly more. But once again, because the Jupiter and the Venus are together, right? Jupiter enlarges, Jupiter multiplies. And even though even though he's getting his fall, he still has the ability to kind of multiply this or make things bigger, right? So somehow this, and it might even not be about expansion or multiplication, but it could be about addiction. Bye, Olivia. Thanks for coming. See you next week. Yeah, it could be, because remember we talked about how Jupiter Venus can represent addiction, because that's where things can go out of control. That's the too much of a good thing. So when we get Jupiter Venus, that's too much of a good thing. That's addiction. This woman's addicted to marriage. She can't function in one. She can't sustain one, but she's addicted to being with one. Matter of fact, she said something like, men like me and I like men, or something like that, right? So she was addicted to kind of getting into these kinds of things. And so that's the main addiction, is relationship, codependency, relationship, but without the ability to be really fully intimate. Look at how the moon's in Leo. This woman was completely narcissistic. The Venus is opposing the Saturn. Maybe even a little, more than likely not frigid, but more corrupt sexually. She was married to Conrad Hilton. And Conrad Hilton is Nick Hilton's father. Nick Hilton is the one who married Elizabeth Taylor. And there's a rumor, not even a rumor, she actually admitted that she had a sexual dalliance with Nick before he met, because Conrad is her first husband from the early 40s. So she had a dalliance with Nick before he met Elizabeth Taylor. So I think what we've got is a corrupted sexuality here, or an amoral. We've got an amoral sexuality. The Saturn can be corruption. It can be frigidity. This person probably, but knowing that we've got these signs are called what? Capricorn is called what? Licentious, right? Capricorn is one of the licentious signs, and that means Mercury, who's the chart ruler, and the Venus are in licentious signs, and then Venus just is separating from her ruler. So there's an opposition with reception. So the Saturn can kind of give her back the licentiousness. And I always find water signs to be very sexual. So that's super interesting. And what we see here is that the Mars has the most, which I find interesting. So the Mars has the most in this particular case. So, the Mars was in the 6th house in Aquarius, the Mars, let's see. The Mars is in the 6th house with Aquarius, in Aquarius. The Mars is with the Uranus and is combusted, is in combustion. And so I think instead of showing whether or not this person can be married, it's maybe showing that this person can't stay married. This person might not be, knowing also that the moon's applying to Mars by opposition. This person is hard to get along with. This person is narcissistic and aggressive and is difficult to get along with, but is extremely sexual and codependent, and so is always looking for the next relationship to get into. Interesting. Okay, so now we come to, any questions about that before we move on to partnerships and enemies? Okay, so now we go into what Benadia thinks about partnership. And the only thing that I thought was really interesting about that is the last paragraph. Indeed, to know the condition of the native with partners and his participators, and what would happen to him because of them. Look at the ascendant and its lord for the native, also the moon, and the 7th and its lord for his partners and participators. Makes perfect sense. Indeed, you will know what kind of being they are going to have in partnership and in participating from the 10th and its lord. Isn't that interesting? So you would not only look to see the ruler of the ascendant and the moon and the ruler of the 7th house and maybe how they're connected, but you'd also look to see the 10th house, which of course is the house of career and public reputation, to see how it was actually going to go. And you'll know the end of it from the 4th and its Lord, right? Because the 4th is the end of things. So I found that to be very interesting. Now, I didn't put a chart forward that was necessarily a chart of a partnership chart, but I thought that'd be kind of interesting. But that's a really interesting thing I thought I would bring up. But what I do have 2 charts, and then of course you all were going to talk about other charts. Chelsea Manning. I think I'd like to look at Chelsea Manning more than Snowden or whatever else. I think Chelsea Manning, because yeah, Chelsea, that one makes good sense. But although even, you know, Chelsea did something that brought an enmity on herself, and so that's kind of my issue, is that what I'm really looking for, and maybe I should bring out Arthur Dreyfus again. Remember from the Dreyfus Affair when we were looking at Mars, because basically Dreyfus got lied on. It's really, we should be looking at Dreyfus, because Dreyfus got lied on, right? Dreyfus was completely above reproach, and there was, you know, there was a royal, or there was a noble person who was a spy, and basically because he was Jewish, they used the Jewishness, they used him as a scapegoat, and that really fits what I'm looking at more. So as opposed to somebody who, you see, in the case of Snowden, in the case of Julian Assange, in the case of Chelsea Manning, all 3 of those people did an action that precipitated their enmity. But in Dreyfus's case, he didn't do anything. He was just minding his own business. And he got accused. That's j'accuse. And that is, matter of fact, j'accuse is what Émile Zola wrote. Émile Zola was a famous French author who got involved in the Dreyfus Affair, and he wrote this thing, an editorial, and it was called J'accuse, and he was basically accusing them of falsely accusing Dreyfus and of anti-Semitism as well, because Dreyfus was one of the first Jewish officers. Anyway, so in qualities which must be perceived, whether the native is going to have enemies openly turning against him, and what would happen to him because of them or from them, it is necessary for us to consider the indications which induce us to know it, namely the ascendant and its lord, the 7th and its lord, the place of the luminaries, the place of the part of fortune and its lord, and the part of enemies and its lord, Saturn and its lord. So let's look at the part of enemies. And Ben Dyke says that he thinks, you know, there are 2 of them, but he thinks that it's the second one we should be looking at because it involves the cusp of the 7th. Hold on a second. The Dreyfus Affair. Yes, the Dreyfus Affair, when we were looking at Mars and we were looking at people who were military, we were looking at the Dreyfus Affair, a guy by the name of Arthur Dreyfus, Dreyfus, I guess, who was one of the first Jewish officers in the French army, and who was accused of treason, falsely accused of treason. Okay, that's 10th house stuff, a lot of nobility, hope, enemies. Bam. A lot of enemies thusly, by day and night, from the lord of the domicile of enemies up to the degree of the domicile itself. Day or night, Saturn to Mars, or this one, day or night from the house of enemies to the degree of it. Now, they're talking not so much about the 7th house as they're talking about the 12th house here. So I'm not really sure what Ben Dykes meant about that. What a lot of making friends and enemies, bringing about a friends and enmity is taken in the day from lot of fortune to the lot of the absent. So that's to the spirit, and so fortune to spirit. That's interesting. Let's see if there's another part of enemies. No. So see the 12th house, the lot of enemies according to Hermes is taken in day and night from the lord of the house of the enemies to the degree of the house of enemies. So the 12th house is what he's talking about here. So let's look at, actually who I wanted to look at was Martin Luther King. But for a second here, I'm going to pull up Arthur Dreyfus as well. Alfred Dreyfus, I always get that wrong. Let's do him first. Note that the Saturn, remember Saturn was one of the things we were looking at. Note that the Saturn is angular. And note that the Saturn is the ruler of the 12th. which is considered the house of enemies, right? Saturn rules the 11th, it's the 1st and the 12th, Aquarius rising. And note also that Saturn is in the 7th, which is the house of open enemies. So I guess we could do that, right? We could move the 7th house ruler to the 7th for open enemies, and we could move the 12th house ruler to the 12th, but I'm going to stick with just the 12th. I'm going to stick with just the 12th. So moving Saturn to 17 degrees of Capricorn is 150 degrees minus 6, moving forward. 150 degrees brings us to Cancer, minus 6 is 4 degrees of Cancer. Note that that's also where the part of fortune is. And note that that's also where this, look at how there's this Jupiter here on it. So there's an exalted planet on not just the part of fortune, but on the part of enemies. An exalted, which makes both of those, what's the word I'm looking for? Which it does two things. First of all, it links fortune to enemies, and then it shows a powerful fortune that involves enemies. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so once again, 23 to 17, 23 Leo to 17 Capricorn, 150 degrees minus 6, was it? Yeah. So 10 degrees Aquarius, 150 degrees is 10 Cancer, minus 4 is 6 degrees of Cancer. So that's pretty interesting already that we have that connection. Where's the moon? And look at what's going on with the moon. The moon is applying to the opposition of Mars. That sounds like enmity as well. Yes? And then what else were we looking at? Remember we were looking at the part of fortune. That was one of the things we want to look at. We look at the ruler of the ascendant. We look at the part of fortune. We look at the ruler of the ascendant, the ruler of the 7th. We look at the position of the moon and the sun, the position of the moon and the sun. And then we also look at the part of fortune, the part of enemies, and Saturn, right? The part of fortune, its lord, the part of enemies, its lord, and Saturn. So as I mentioned, the Saturn puts us in the house of open enemies. Look at how it's with K2 as well. So we know there's going to be some kind of disillusionment. I mean, from what I understand, he had a very good marriage. And so we can see the ruler of the 7th with the Venus and the Mercury. He had a very good marriage. And but he had very bad open enemies. So let's now look at the triplicity rulers. So the first triplicity ruler is marriage, right? And it's daytime, so that's Sun, and there he is with those lovely 2 planets there, and he's fallen, so he can combust, but not quite as strongly as if he were in Aries or Leo, right? And Venus is super strong. I mean, she's weakened by the combustion, but she's in her own sign. So she's calling the shots for this combustion, even though he's taking on her signification. And then the second triplicity ruler would be Jupiter, who's on both the part of fortune and the part of enemies. So Jupiter is the ruler of contention in this chart, right? As the second triplicity ruler of the 7th house, Jupiter represents contention. This is the most dignified chart in the planet. This is the most dignified planet in the chart. This is the most dignified planet in the chart. And note that after the moon is going to apply to the opposition of Mars, she is going to apply to the trine of Jupiter. She's going to apply to the trine of Jupiter. And she's the ruler of the part of fortune, and she's also the ruler of the part of enemies, and the ruler of the part of enemies is opposing Mars. And note also that Mars is the exaltation ruler of the 12, and I think if we looked at the triplicity rulers of the 12th house, this is the first triplicity ruler of the 12th is enemies, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just see here for a second. Benatti on triplicities. Share this so you can see it too. First Lord of the Triplicity of the 12th house signifies enemies. Let's look and see who that might be. That would be, it is daytime, it would be Venus. Isn't that interesting? So Venus would represent this. Look at, she's strong. She's strong herself, but she's being obscured by the sun. So this could be, now remember what I said, that it was nobility. It was an Esterhazy. If anybody's into classical music, that name should be relatively well known, because the Esterhazys were the patrons of Joseph Haydn. Joseph Haydn is the creator of the classical music style. So the classical music period is between like 1735 or 1740 until Beethoven. Essentially, Beethoven breaks down the classical style, and so that would be until like the 1820s. And Mozart is the greatest exponent of the classical style of music. We call it all classical, but there is a period that is called classical, and that is the period that is Haydn and Mozart. And they called Haydn Papa Haydn. Haydn is the person who created the string quartet. Haydn is the person who actually codified and perfected what the symphony was going to become. Haydn is the person who codified what we call sonata form and things of that nature. So Haydn is really, really important to classical music, and to especially the classical era. And he was extremely beneficially patronized by this royal family called the Esterhazys. So we see a very well dignified Venus with the royalty, with the planet of royalty. So the Esterhazy is the enemy. Now, he had more than just the Esterhazy as enemy, because there was also rampant anti-Semitism. Yes. So since France was Catholic, and Catholics all believed that the Jews killed Jesus, and so there was all this gigantic anti-Semitism, and so he had lots of enemies anyway, because he was already Jewish. So this already kind of shows what we just looked at, that this is definitely a chart that points to enmity. And I wouldn't be surprised if, I didn't really go into it too deeply, I wouldn't be surprised if some of this enmity affected the marriage down the road. It'd be interesting to see if that were the case. The next chart I want to look at, and if anybody would be interested in looking up, no, we did Dreyfus. Dreyfus. We decided not to do Chelsea Manning because she had brought on her enmity. But here's someone who didn't necessarily. Martin Luther King. Let me enlarge. Okay, so Martin Luther King had practically the entire white race was against Martin Luther King. Many of the black race was against Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, on some level, you could say that Martin Luther King brought it on himself too, in a similar way that Chelsea Manning might have. But Chelsea Manning basically, she's a whistleblower. So that's a totally kind of a different kind of thing. Although he's kind of a whistleblower too. I don't know, maybe this isn't the best chart for it, maybe in a second. But one of the reasons I wanted to use this chart is because it has a B rating. And since it has a B rating, I thought it'd be interesting to see if the chart really does point to negativity, to enemies and negativity. So let's just kind of go through it and then see. So the first thing is, here's the part of fortune, and with the moon and Venus together, and Venus exalted and with the moon. The ruler of the ascendant, and Venus is the ruler of the ascendant with the ruler of the part of fortune. Then the second thing we were looking at is the ruler of the seventh. There is the Mars, and there would be the open enemy. And look at here, we've got Mars opposing Saturn, and we know the term I use for that is calamity, war and calamity. So already with the seventh house, and it's daytime, so the second triplicity ruler of which represents contention is Mars. So this Mars-Saturn is a major part of this contention aspect, and he's also the ruler of the seventh. Secondly, the next, what was it we were going to look for is the ruler of the part. Now, Mars rules the seventh and the 12th. It rules both the open enemy and the hidden enemy. We move it back to 8 Aries. So it's what? Back 60 minus 13. And is it fully 13? Not quite. Okay, so back 60. We'll just put it in the first degree of Pisces. So this Jupiter in the 12th becomes the ruler of it. Now, is there any connection between that and the ruler of the Ascendant? Well, it rules the ruler of the Ascendant. The Jupiter's in the 12th, even though it belongs to the first, it's in the 12th of enemies. Is it connected to the ruler of the 7th? Not necessarily. And there's the Saturn, which was the last thing we were looking for. So I think that that's also another chart that gives us a good kind of idea of that kind of the kind of enmity that we're talking about. I've got some other people. I've got a chart of somebody who's never been married, myself. So one of the things that, let me enlarge. Never been married, never been in a relationship longer than 1 month. Okay, so you all talk to me. What says no marriage in this chart? What do we look at? What do you remember what we're supposed to be looking at? First, what, 7th house and its lord? Obviously I don't like women, but so I don't know if I would necessarily, but I could still just look at women as Venus and the moon. Notice how Venus is with Mars, and we know that that tends to create ardor, sexual ardor, sexual passion, and it can also create sexual what's what I'm looking for? Scandal. It can create, yeah, what were we gonna say? It can create scandal. And definitely when I was in high school, I was outed because I was in love with my neighbor, my male neighbor, and confessed to him, and it ended up getting all over school, and I ended up becoming the school fag for the next 4 years of high school. So that definitely I even have a sexual or a scandal of a sexual nature there. And well, let's look at the parts of marriage actually. So the first one is Saturn to Venus, and so that's back 30 and forward, back 30 and forward 1. So that brings us to 28 degrees of Scorpio, and there the Venus is with the Mars. So that wouldn't necessarily say there's no marriage, right? Although Venus and Mars in Aquarius, I mean, Aquarius is not a particularly amorous sign, so that would certainly cool down some of the ardor. And I do go through, and I'm actually in one right now, I do go through asexual periods, and I'm definitely aromantic. That's definitely an aspect of me. I go in and out of asexuality, but I'm most definitely aromantic. And then the next one, which is what, is it Sun to Venus? Okay, so that's forward 30 degrees and forward 3. 3 and what? A little less than 3. Okay, so 3 would be 29 and 3 minutes or something like that. Or what is it? 10:36 to 13:28. So not quite. So it'd be like 2 degrees and 52 minutes. 2 degrees and 52. Okay, so not quite. So 2 is 28 and 52 is 84. So 29, 24. Okay, so yeah, so it puts us in the 30th degree of Capricorn. 30th degree of Capricorn. Note how it's in the 30th degree, first of all, but then also note that the Saturn is opposing the part of fortune. So this part of marriage, this ruler of the part of marriage is opposing the life path on some level. We could actually say. Also note that we've got a sterile sign on the 7th, and we've also got a Mercury sign on the 7th. And so we've talked about this before, that the Mercury signs are sterile because Mercury doesn't grow up. Mercury is immaturity. Mercury is youth. Mercury is, is Peter Pan. And certainly there's a very strong Peter Pan aspect to me. Now you think with the Mercury so close to the Ascendant, right, that's the ruler of the 7th, that might be, this feels like it. Hey dude, we're talking about my chart. Good God, we haven't even talked about, we're not even talking about you.
It's very similar. It's very similar. It's hard not to feel attacked.
Dude, This is me and my burden here. The
What
void of course.
about the moon? I was thinking about your moon also being in a barren sign and in the fourth house.
Well, Aries is not barren. It's a sign of few children, but it's hot and dry.
Hot and dry, and being in the fourth house, isn't that like hidden more?
Yeah. Good point. Excellent point. And note that that Cancer is, what is it? Cancer is part of the seventh house. The moon is the other seventh house ruler.
Right.
So maybe that means after 60. Stranger things have happened. When I lived in Thailand, Diana says, my ascendant, welcome back, Diana, by the way. I didn't say hi to you when you came in, but so great to see you. So great to have you back. My ascendant is Gemini ruled by Mercury, and I do come off very jovial, even though I'm older, or youthful. And so same thing. Usually when you've got the Virgo in the ascendant, Gemini, especially Gemini ascendant, I think that's when you really get the youthfulness. In this particular case, of course, I've got the Sag ascendant, but I've got the ruler of the ascendant in Gemini, and then the ruler of Gemini on the ascendant. So there's definitely one of the things I tend to tell people is I'm very emotionally mature, but I don't really adult very well. And so that's really the case. I'm actually very anti-adulthood. And I think adulthood ultimately is a scam. And it's something that we're supposed to not be able to wait until we get to, and then we get to it, and what does it all entail? Responsibility and work and shit that's boring and shit that fucks us over. And so I've always somehow found ways to kind of avoid being fully an adult. I've never been married. I've never had my own children, meaning that I've never had to provide for a family, which is a kind of as far as males are concerned, which is an aspect of adulthood. I mean, it's for women too, but because nowadays both people need to work in order to be able to really provide for their families. But I've never had to do that, and that's one of the main staples of adulthood is coupling, and then having children, and then taking care of doing the things that you have to in order to take care of them, and making sure that you provide for them for their present and their future. I've never had to do that, so I could go live in Thailand. I could, when the pandemic happened, I could come here. And even
sometimes it's overrated as someone who's done those things.
Has done what things? The being married and having
being married. I don't have children of my own, but I basically raised my husband's children, who's a widower.
That's right.
Yeah. So I've done all of those things, and I'm actually a young empty nester, and I'm enjoying it very much.
Very good. So exactly, it's the kind of the freedom people. When I lived in Texas, one of the things that really bothered me about Texas was how nobody could wait to play with what I call the adult toys. Like everybody was getting engaged at 23, 24. People were getting married in 22, 23, 24. It was like the 50s. People were still coming. People were marrying their high school sweethearts. I met many people
like
who were.
That. It's still like that. I grew up in Texas. It's still like that.
It is. It's exactly still like that. I mean, I was in Austin for 5 years, and people having more than 2 or 3 children, having more than 3 children. Like my best friend in Texas, he's got 4 children, and he and the wife were having problems when they found out that the 4th one was there. When she got pregnant with the 4th one, they were already having major problems. And so, he's got, I think his oldest kid is now maybe 21, and the youngest is 8 or 9, maybe 10.
Wow.
So he's got all of this. He's got, he won't really be free. He kind of has to. I mean, he's also native Austinite. So his mother and father are still alive. He's got the responsibility to them, and then he's got the responsibility for these 4 kids as well. And so it's just like he's trapped. And to be honest with you, he would love it here better than I would. He loves the water. He loves the beach. He can't stay away from the water. He's a master swimmer. He would love this. He would. I mean, if he could, I'm sure that if he could just kind of get up and get out of here, get out of Texas and come down here and live here, he would do it. Or in Tulum or something, he would do it. But he can't, because he's got all these adult responsibilities. So I think really this chart, one of the things about this chart, now that I'm kind of looking at it in a kind of a different way based on having an audience, is there's a real resistance to adulthood in this chart. There's no real interest in adulthood. There's really an interest in youth. There's a real inclination towards youth and the things of youth, despite the fact that, like I said, I'm a very emotionally mature person. I don't do a lot of drama. Like, we meet people like my parents. My parents were, they were fully adults, mortgage, child, marriage, car note, all that bullshit. But neither of them were any older than, were emotionally older than 5 or 6. You know what I mean? So, we know adults like that, where they've actually never really fully matured mentally or emotionally, but otherwise they have been, they've been doing everything that they've been doing everything that they're supposed to do as adults. And that's where deadbeat fathers come in, and that's where moms that neglect their children because they're going from relationships to relationships come in, and that kind of thing. So it's how we deal with responsibility, how we deal with that kind of adult responsibility. This chart is not bothered. This chart is not bothered with that at all. And so I think that's also, it's not, like I say, it's an aromantic chart. The Gemini on the 7th, the Jupiter, the ruler of the Ascendant in the 7th as well. So, I think that's part of what's going on with me and why. And then, of course, if we look from the part of fortune, the 7th from the part of fortune has Saturn in it. And it brings us back to this Jupiter, who's retrograde and in detriment. That's the other thing. This is a retrograde detriment chart ruler in the 7th house. It's going to bring problems.
Is Venus trining your Jupiter here?
Not quite. It's not within my.
Quite, right?
Yeah, not quite yet.
Okay.
It would have to be, let's see, she gets 3.5, he gets 4, or he gets 4.5. So it'd have to be within 8 degrees. It's 9 degrees now. Excuse me. Yeah, it'd have to be, it's approaching. But she's also about to go into her first station and go retrograde.
Right.
So that's what this chart doesn't say, is that Venus is within 2 weeks, she's slowing down. She's about to go stationary, and then she's going to go back.
I have questions. What is the signification of a planet that's about to go stationary and go retrograde or come back from being retrograde?
Good question.
I just found out that my Mercury is literally the day before it starts stationing direct, but I was born with Mercury retrograde, so I didn't know that at all. I just found it out looking it up.
Oh, so you're in the second. You're approaching the second station. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I was born Mercury retrograde in December, and then like the next day it stations direct.
Oh, I see. So I would consider that essentially approaching its second station.
Okay.
Okay. So here we go. A planet in the first station is like a man ignorant of what he should do, whose bad end is already present, right? Because remember, they considered retrogradation to be a major impediment.
Okay.
And let's see, and if it were in the second station, about to go direct, it is like one hoping for some matter, nor will his hope be disappointed. So so what that would basically say is kind of you're at the end of whatever challenges will be represented by that retrogradation. What houses does it rule?
The ninth, it's Mercury rules my 9th house in Gemini and my 12th house Virgo. Yeah.
12. Okay, so whatever challenges that would go around those two areas. So if there were challenges around education.
Yeah, I have the moon in Gemini and Saturn in the 12th in Virgo, so.
Oh, okay, so you've even got the square there.
Yep.
So there would be challenges around religion versus spirituality too.
Yes, agreed. Maybe that's why I'm here.
Yeah, exactly.
I was raised Catholic.
Ooh, say no more. My uncle is a Monsignor, and so say no more.
Yeah.
So a retrograde planet, standing towards retrogradation is like a nervous person on account of fearing bad things in the future. A retrograde planet signifies disobedience and contradiction and turning back and taking back and diversity or discord. Remember we talked about that, Layla, and all of the connection with retrograde, how we kind of got into that when we looked at the Bonatti of the considerations.
Yeah, we did.
A retrograde planet signifies antagonism and the dissipation of everything considered. Right? Because remember, the best thing for a planet is to be in a state of advancement. And advancement means what? When you advance, you do what? You move forward. You move forward. And so the worst, another bad thing for the planet is to be in a state of retreat. Retreat, go back. Right? So retrograde planet signifies antagonism and the dissipation of everything considered. And then retrograde, like one returning and pulling back. Stationary in the second station, like one hoping for good. Oh, someone says they've got 5 planets in retrograde, right? So that's a challenge. Now, once again, let's not forget, anything can be made to work on the personal level, right? My chart ruler is retrograde. That's, I mean, that is what it is what it is, and certainly there are issues in relation to it. But one of the things, one of the things that Jyotish tends to talk about is that planets that are retrograde give the effects of the opposite sign. Now I don't know if I'm completely with that on this Western side, but of course now I've got the Jupiter retrograde in Gemini. So as a result of that, that makes it easy for me to act like the other sign. You see what I'm saying? It makes it easy for me to act like a Gemini instead of acting like a Sagittarius. Although they're both present because, of course, Mercury is in Sagittarius. So I'm getting both elements. I mean, here look at what's behind me, right? So there's the Sagittarius behind me, and this is the Mercury in Gemini. Or this is the Gemini Mercury aspect. That this teaching thing and talking, disseminating information. Last week we were talking about, oh shit, I just forgot what my train of thought was. Anyway, I'm going to stop. Do you have any questions that you want to be on the recording before I turn it off? Okay.